to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Well, welcome to the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. This is the Professional School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. I'm Professor Larry Jacobs, and I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance, which has organized this session. We're delighted to have you. Before we begin, I just want to encourage everyone here and also online to participate. And you can do that by submitting questions. If you're online, you'll see at the bottom of the screen, there is a button for questions. You'll also see right next to that button, there's closed captions if you'd like to use that. So we try to please everyone. Welcome to today's program, Making Sense of the 2026 Midterms. This is part of our series this fall. We've got a number of programs that we're calling The Road to November, the 2026 midterm elections. First, I want to introduce my co-moderator, Dave Hage. Dave, some of you will know, worked at the Star Tribune, New York Times, U.S. News World Report, and elsewhere for 30 years or so. He was also, in addition to being a journalist, he was on the editorial board at the Star Tribune. And is an author of a number of books. He's also won a Pulitzer Prize, Edward R. Murrow Award, and a prize from the professional journalism group here in Minnesota. So it's great to have you. Thanks, Dave. And it's a particular pleasure to have our guest from Washington, D.C., James Hohmann, a product of Apple Valley, Minnesota. Yeah. Okay, let's get that out front. James is an all-star, and I could spend some time here going through his rise. I first got to know him because he started something in DC known 202, which is the area code for Washington. It was the inside the Beltway place to start at 4 or 5 a.m. to know what was coming that day. And from that, he went on to a number of other positions. Today, he is a deputy opinion editor at the Washington Post and holds a number of other positions. He is overseeing the editorial board, so you'll see that in some of the questions. He's a lecturer at Stanford University, and so it's a great pleasure to have you. If you've got questions about politics and the media, I can't think of anyone better to have that conversation with. And James is also a really nice guy, and you're all going to see that coming. So let me start. Mr. Hage, some questions?
I do. I'm going to dig in with a couple of journalism questions for the wretched hacks in our crowd. James, a year or two ago, the owner, Jeff Bezos, famously imposed a new mandate for the editorial page to focus on free markets and individual liberties. I'm a former editorial writer, and I would have thought, but correct me if I'm wrong, that could exclude certain topics that have traditionally been topics for comment, healthcare, environment, public education, abortion rights. Am I wrong about that, or do you feel a new focus?
Well, great to be with you. Great to be home. This is the best time of year to be in Minnesota. The owner has set a direction. Every single one of those topics we've continued to write about proudly and outspokenly. We continue to host a marketplace of ideas on our page. We have columnists across the ideological spectrum from the left to the right. And I think the broad mandate of free markets and personal liberties leaves a lot of room to debate. How do you advance free markets? What are the right limits to put? How do you make sure that people aren't getting left behind? How do you, when personal liberties come into conflict, how do you balance that? And so I think in this crowded space where there's so many places to get information, it's good to want to be known for something. And that's what we've tried to do over the last couple of years. I have not been unable to write about anything. And I'm really proud of the product that we're putting out every day. And I think we have a really good team of people, and we're trying to produce journalism that really can appeal to all Americans.
One more on journalism. Okay. A lot of people remember what some people call the golden age of newspapers, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, when newspapers made a lot of money, kind of a monopoly on advertising in certain news markets. And many papers were owned by what used to be called the gentleman publishers, you know, the Chandlers, the Binghams, the Coleses, the Grahams, who it appeared, you know, put pride over profits and really poured money into the news up. The Minneapolis Tribune had a Saigon bureau at one time, and a Paris bureau, and a New York bureau, if you can believe it. Well, the days of effortless profitability are long gone for newspapers. So, in other words, they could meet both missions. They could earn a profit for the owner, and they could have very high quality news coverage. The era of effortless profitability for newspapers is gone. How do you meet the twin mandates today? How does a newspaper meet the twin mandates today?
It's incredibly challenging. I mean, the economic headwinds are very real. AI is very disruptive. You think about like how much search traffic used to bring people into stories, and now there's the summaries at the top. So you have to find new ways to reach people, and you have to. I ultimately think in this crowded space, having a good story to tell, having good characters, good reporting is more important than ever, because I think just aggregating or telling, we don't need a wire service. We need people to help make sense of the world. And so I think there are actually a lot of opportunities, but it's really hard. What I worry about a lot is local news. I think that's the most important. And I got my start in San Jose and was in Dallas and Los Angeles, and those markets don't have the kind of robust local coverage that they used to. And so that it pains me. But I am ultimately optimistic because I think there is a demand for high quality information. And, if we just wanted to maximize profit, we would approach things very differently. We really do still cover DC, for example, and we write a lot. For years we had a bureau in Afghanistan, and it was America's longest war. People weren't reading stories about what was happening in Afghanistan, but you continue to cover it because it's important, and you need to bear witness. And then all of a sudden it became very important. It's now been 5 years since the withdrawal, but we've continued to cover that story even as other people have moved on, including the Afghan refugees, the visa holders, whose recently as this week are having their visas canceled, which we have very strongly condemned.
Ask you a series of questions about balancing different priorities in the media, because there's not a yes and a no. And one of the challenges of covering, particularly campaigns, is you've got this tension between intense coverage of each minutia of the daily campaign, a gaffe here, a trip here, and what was said and who showed up, and maybe a poll that comes out just at that moment, versus covering issues of deep consequence to voters. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell you that voters are really worried about inflation and prices today. They're not that keen about the Iran war. So how do you balance those things?
It's very challenging. I think it's very easy to become reactive in political reporting and to respond to whatever the latest outrage is, and it takes real discipline to look at the deeper issue. And I do think we're living through one of these once in a generation realignments. We're a decade into it now. We lived through one with FDR and the New Deal. None of us were around for that, but Reagan, I think, ushered in a realignment. Trump we don't know how it's going to end, but there are these there are people who voted for Mitt Romney in 2012 who will never vote for a Republican again. There are people who voted for Barack Obama in 2012 who will never vote for a Democrat again. And so there is, I think, explaining the polarization, looking at how the map is changing. It ultimately, the parties are evolving pretty dramatically, and it's easy to lose sight of that. But so I think that's where you do, some of the hubbub about Israel and the Democratic Party, that is getting at deeper tensions inside the coalition. So I think some of it is covering one-off incremental developments, but in a way that offers the deeper context of what's happening, but also the historical perspective of how the party's coalitions got to where they are.
Here's another kind of balanced question, which is the media since the beginning, at least modern media, has had as one of its core missions establishing kind of a factual basis for voters and Americans to reach decisions. So you got facts on one side. On the other side, you've got campaigns that are, to different extents, sending out messages that are false, misleading, or just made up. With AI, it's like a whole new ball game. So how do you balance the search for facts with the arrival of these misinformation, with the fear that you could inadvertently provide amplification of it? Exactly.
Yeah, you want to be the signal in the noise. There's so much crap out there, and how do you give meaning and explain what's really going on? A lot of people aren't, even right now, I mean, everyone in this room is, but we're, I guess, just under 90 days out, 88 days out from the midterms. Most voters still aren't engaged in a deep way in these races. And so it's hard too, because you want to do these big 30,000 foot pieces that look at the races, but you also don't want to just fall into the horse race trap of who's up and who's down. And what we obviously all care about the polls, but there's way too much coverage of polling, and not enough coverage of the underlying issues. And so how do you make sure, like, okay, why, but also not to tread into like data centers, but it's one thing to write about, okay, these politicians are staking out these anti-data center positions. What were their previous positions? What are the underlying realities? How should you be thinking about it? You need the context as much as the facts to really illuminate rather than inflame.
Let me give you a concrete example, see where we get with that. In the 2024 campaign, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance leapt on a social media fabrication that Haitians were eating pets in Springfield, Ohio. So do you go after that and say, as plenty of media organizations did, this is complete fabrication? Or do you worry that you'll be inadvertently fueling attention to it, with some voters, maybe a lot of voters, taking it as truth?
The Haitian one is very interesting because they've now revoked the TPS, temporary protected status. And so I don't know if folks saw in the news this week, like 27 people were killed in Haiti. The situation on the ground is very bad in Port-au-Prince. The gangs are in control. There's supposed to be this UN peacekeeping force. There's supposed to be 5,000 peacekeepers. There's 900, and it's really bad. And it's frankly unconscionable that we're sending these people back into Haiti when the country is such a mess. And so I think that they're eating the cats and dogs demagoguery that was a stand-in for something deeper, right? And so it's, do you engage on the underlying kind of the dog whistle, or do you look at what the deeper message that he's trying to convey is with that?
Looking back at how the Post, but also other media covered that, do you think too much attention was given to?
I don't, because I think it said, I mean, frankly, it said a lot about how Donald Trump was going to govern, and it, we sent reporters to Springfield, Ohio, and we had an interview with Mike DeWine, the Republican governor, who criticized Trump and Vance, who was the senator from Ohio at the time, very strongly for what he said were false statements. And so yeah, I think it was a major issue in the 2024 campaign. And ultimately, you know, Trump, I covered the Republican and Democratic convention in 2024 in Milwaukee. People were waving printed signs that said mass deportations now at the Republican convention. That was what Trump was running on. And so it was part of his message. And obviously immigration, which was an asset for him in 2024, has become a liability, as we've seen in Ground Zero and in the Twin Cities. And so I think it's totally fair game to flood the zone.
Here's maybe a little more subtle example of what I'm trying to get at. Donald Trump continuously described, as did the campaign's ads, Kamala Harris as the immigration czar. The border czar, and it wasn't true. She never had enforcement. Biden had given her responsibility for examining the deeper causes of immigration from Central America. How do you handle that issue? And do you think that issue, just by reporting what Trump was saying, was amplified?
This is a very good question. I mean, one of the challenges is the Democrats. I mean, Trump won a lot of votes on immigration in 2024, and I think that there were downplaying the very real impact that millions of people arriving at the southern border had. Democrats didn't want to grapple with that. Biden didn't move aggressively enough until it was too late, and it became a huge political headache. And I think that the press, frankly, earlier in the Biden term could have done a better job at capturing how it was becoming a real political liability for Democrats, rather than sort of minimizing the very real impact that a lot of people were feeling from the mass influx of immigrants.
James, I'd like to return to this issue of facts versus lies, as Larry raised the topic a minute ago about having a factual reality. I think there was a time when voters, citizens relied on news organizations, not just newspapers, but Walter Cronkite and WCCO, for a common factual reality. And you could argue that we need that in a democracy. Democrats and Republicans might disagree on how to solve the federal budget deficit, but they agreed that there is a federal budget deficit. They might disagree on techniques for addressing air pollution, but they agreed there is air pollution. Now, with the falling trust in traditional news organizations for some good reasons, and Trump's overt effort to undermine trust, do you see any hope that America ever gets back to a shared respect for facts and a shared factual reality as a foundation for governing?
I hope so. The people in this room give me hope. I think most Americans want to be informed. They want to make good decisions, and so much of what people are getting is slop. And we can prepare vegetables and make them delicious, but if people don't want to eat their vegetables, they're not going to eat them. And so I do worry about that. I do worry that in the second Trump term versus the first Trump term, a lot of people who were really engaged are now not engaged. Minnesota is an exception to that in a lot of ways. We've always had the highest voter turnout, something I'm very proud of. But I think a lot of people are checked out of politics. They've turned off the news, and that makes me anxious for sure, because it does allow sort of vibes-based politics.
In Dostoevsky's famous Grand Inquisitor chapter, a cardinal comes to Jesus in a prison cell and says, "The people don't need you anymore. We give them everything they want. You're done, man. You're obsolete." Have we reached that point in America where citizens say, we're done with all that old stuff, news, informed citizenship? We don't need that anymore. We want a leader who tells us either what makes us angry or what makes us happy, and we don't need you anymore.
I don't think so. I'm not as pessimistic. I think that people want to be informed, and our institutions are holding imperfectly. They're being strained and challenged. But the Supreme Court, while Trump got some big wins last term, they did check him on some big issues. You're seeing signs of Republicans on Capitol Hill pushing back on Trump. I think I'm very proud of the news reporting that the Post has been doing in recent weeks on what the administration is up to. And so I think the institutions are holding. We're going to have elections this fall that I'm eager to talk about. And I think we'll see the pendulum move back. So I think I feel good. And I actually think we're at the dawn of, I think AI has pitfalls for sure, but also so much promise. And I do think it is going to improve life for a lot of people. And so I think there are a lot of reasons to feel like we can get through this dark chapter.
I admire your optimism.
Thanks,
Thank
Larry.
you so much. And thank you for coming to Minnesota to share it.
Yeah.
Please give us your questions. Those of you who are here, Cody, Jackie will be walking around picking them up. Got a bunch of questions here about the fall campaign, which you said you'd like to talk about. And basically it boils down to this theme we've been talking about, which is we know that Donald Trump and Republicans are going to be hammering the Democrats for being socialists, or as Donald Trump said, communists. And of course, there are some candidates who are democratic socialists. How does the media, how should they approach those attacks?
There is a real fight inside the Democratic Party. It's a legitimate fight. I think that the strength of the DSA is to some degree overstated, but I think that the leaders, the Democratic leaders right now are Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, who both represent New York City, and they are very afraid of the restiveness inside the party. And I think they've been hesitant to push back on some of the more extreme positions that the DSA does have. And so I think it's fair game to talk about like the ascendancy of the DSA, the fight between more progressive candidates and more establishment candidates. And I think that it's ultimately, you want it to be based on the underlying positions, not just based on, Trump bloviating about these are communists or, whatever. The other thing is, like, to your first question about free market, the editorial page of the Washington Post is not a socialist. It's not a socialist page. And name calling is not enough. You need to actually persuade people. You can't just say socialist. You have to explain why you think city-run grocery stores are not a good idea. And we have an editorial that went up this morning about how a lot of minority bodega owners in New York City who have bodegas right across from where these city-run grocery stores that Zoran Mamdani is going to open are very concerned that it's going to put a squeeze on their business, and he's undercutting market prices by 30%. And like, you can't just say socialist. You have to say, here's why this socialist idea is going to not work. And here's why it hasn't worked when it was tried in Kansas City. And so I think there's too much name calling and too much amplifying of the name calling and not enough actually assessing the underlying policy.
So when the Republicans are hammering Democrats for being socialist, even if they're not in the DSA, the responsibility of the media is to sort that out?
Well, and I think that will, like, or be like, they're not a socialist. I mean, that's, and it's, I think that there is a responsibility to say, like, okay, this is over-torqued, this is overstated. And it's hard because you look like you're a player in the game, and we really are trying to be umpires, calling balls and strikes, telling it like it is. And so telling it like it is saying, like, this person does have a lot of socialist views, or actually this person is not. This person's record isn't, they've disavowed these other people. Or if they're not disavowing them, I mean, it's not fair to make everyone disavow everyone, but Hassan Piker has said a lot of very odious things. And when he's campaigning in Michigan with Abdul El-Sayed, and like, it's fair game to ask Abdul El-Sayed, like, do you agree with these things that he says? And if El-Sayed says no, that's news. If he says yes, that's news. If he says no comment, that's news. So I think it is legitimate to ask those questions.
We've got a question here from the audience in front of us. We've been talking a lot about the parties and false information. And this is just like a basic question. Do bread and butter issues determine the outcome of elections?
Less than we think. I mean, we're so polarized. Yeah, when you look at the polls, it's obviously everyone should be talking about inflation and affordability all the time. But that actually, I mean, the tribalism is a very real problem, and polarization is real. The map is actually very relatively small this fall of truly competitive races, and most of these races are just people putting on red jerseys or blue jerseys, and it's become about mobilization of your voters rather than persuasion, and especially in a midterm election where turnout is lower than in a presidential election. In a state like Texas, Republicans just have to figure out how to get Republican voters to show up to vote against James Tallarico. They don't have to make an affirmative case, and that is disheartening. But that is what politics has become in a lot of places. It's about mobilization.
We've got a series of questions here about the recent Supreme Court decision, which said that Donald Trump could continue to make preparations of regulations with regards to mail-in ballots. Now, it's very important to say this decision, if you read it carefully, is not a ruling on the law. It's kind of a legalistic ruling saying that this case does not have standing, meaning that there has not yet been material damage that the plaintiffs could point to. So knowing that it's still up in the air to some extent, let me ask you a couple questions that have been raised. Who is this going to help? Because in some states, the Republicans do rely on mail-in voting. In Florida, mail-in voting is quite important because of the senior vote.
Trump voted by mail.
Yeah. So who do you think it's going to help or hurt?
In the current situation, I do think I mean, if Trump gets his way, it ends up hurting Democrats more than Republicans. And the GOP realizes that a lot of their coalition does actually vote by mail now. They want to get these votes locked in. The crass political view is that Trump, by falsely claiming that the 2020 election was stolen, has habituated a lot of Republican voters to not trust the process, and that as a result, there are Republican voters who won't vote because they think that elections can just be stolen. And so one of the things that panics Republican strategists who are actually focused on the nuts and bolts of these elections is, how do you convince people that their vote is going to count? And so talking about election integrity and a lot of these orders that are mostly for show helps shore up confidence on the right that the election will be legitimate. And I mean, I think so in the short term, yes, it hurts Democrats more. In the long term, the Republican coalition is increasingly going to use mail-in balloting. And so that's, it shakes out different ways in different states. But it is funny how these things change. I mean, I remember in 2010, it was sort of like the Republican electorate is much more likely to vote in non-presidential elections, and now the Democratic electorate is, just because college educated, the people who are now Democratic voters are the people who are more likely to vote in off-year elections. And it's really hard when Trump's not on the ballot to motivate a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump 3 times to go vote for someone else.
This is related to this question, some folks online and then here with us who asked a simple question, should I vote? And some folks say, should I vote at all? Or others are saying, should I vote by mail? Is that a risky proposition now? What do you say to people like
They
that?
absolutely should vote. I mean, I do, my unpopular view is that, like, I understand early vote. Minnesota, as everyone here knows, votes first in the presidential elections. I want people to be able to vote. I believe in like souls to the polls. But my sort of my controversial view is like, look at how some of these elections where there's like late breaking information about candidates. Like in Virginia, where I live now, we've had like multiple special elections and primaries, and early voting starts. We also start 45 days early. And so it's just like early voting is going on constantly. And I do think like when you're voting a month and a half out, like a lot could happen. But that's not an excuse to restrict voting, but it is, I think there probably is too much early voting.
I want to get back to the amplification question because I agree with you. I think there's been some real threats to the political system, but if you pay attention, there's also quite a bit of growing resistance to Donald Trump, even among some Republicans, and on the international stage. So my question is, how do you balance coverage of Donald Trump's talk about elections being fraudulent and the Supreme Court's decision, which I think is some people have been misread, so that it doesn't become an amplification of the why should I vote? Pete?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in your thoughts on that too. I think you have to give people a reason to vote and talk about what's at stake. I mean, think about how many people didn't vote in 2024 because they thought there was no difference between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Like, how does that look now? Like the like uncommitted movement, and which was foreseeable at the time. So that it is. I think you have, if Trump is mucking around in elections, you've got to write about that. I think one of the dangerous thing that people have fallen into the trap of is saying that everything is a threat to democracy, because there are real threats to democracy and there are things that aren't threats to democracy. And so you have to kind of pick where
Could you give an example of something that's getting a lot of coverage that's not a threat to democracy? Because I'm on the same page. I'm a little appalled, even among my colleagues. It's just like game up.
Yeah.
Democracy is dying and maybe in some respects dead.
Yeah, like we got a lot of heat because we ran an editorial when Texas was doing the redistricting, and we said what Texas is doing is bad and dumb and wrong and will probably backfire because these are dummy manders, and you're assuming that all these Hispanic voters who backed Trump in 2024 are going to stick with Republicans in 26. That's probably a mistaken assumption. But it's not a threat to democracy because Democrats are going to respond. Like, that was what we said, this is going to cause a race to the bottom. Texas shouldn't do this, but if Texas does it, California is going to do it. And then you're just going to have states retaliating. And so it is, I think it's a terrible practice for politicians to choose their voters as opposed to the other way around. But we ran an editorial that said what Texas is doing is not a threat to democracy because other states can respond, and democracy, people are still going to vote. And like, there are a lot of districts where you may think a Republican is going to win because Trump won the district by 10 points. But in fact, the backlash is such that that may not pan out. And we got so much criticism for saying this isn't a threat to democracy because, and understandably, people are, oh, you're changing the boundaries and everything. But it was sort of like, no, that's not actually a threat to democracy itself. And it's hard because people still will like screen grab that from 15 months ago and say, oh, they were dismissive of of this, and it was just like, no, no, no. If you actually read the piece, that was the context.
And I would just add to that, I think one of the challenges with democracy is dead as an argument is it's become so partisan.
Right.
You know, you're basically taking a Democratic talking point and running with it, despite, I don't want to overstate it, but despite some evidence that it's uneven and maybe becoming increasingly uneven in terms of resistance and resilience of the system itself. Mr. Hagi.
In retirement, I'm on the board of a nonprofit here called Clean Elections Minnesota, nonpartisan, but we try to get money out of politics and promote trust in the system, get people to vote. And one of the themes that my colleagues there have talked about is why people can trust our elections. It's your neighbors who are volunteers that are sitting at the polling place. They know you, and Steve Simon has talked about the safeguards. But twofold question. How do we restore people's confidence in elections, that elections are fair, clean? They might not go the way you want, but they're not rigged. And second, is it a news organization's responsibility, because it does seem like an anti-Trump message now, it seems partisan, is it a news organization's responsibility to try to point that out, that elections by and large are pretty clean, pretty fair, pretty rigorous in America?
Yeah, it absolutely is incumbent upon us to do that. And I think it also goes like with the socialist name calling thing. You have to show, not tell. It's not enough to just be like, these elections are fine. Or like Trump claims, to your amplification question, Trump claims without evidence that these elections are rigged. Like that, people just kind of read over, it's like, okay, what does that mean? You have to lay it out. And that does take more work. My two people I know very well, Ben Ginsburg, who's a Republican election lawyer, and Bob Bauer, who was Barack Obama's White House counsel and Biden's personal lawyer. They have a really, I think, actually very cool initiative where they go around, and before the 2024 elections, they went to all the major media markets in the swing states, and they got together local civic leaders, business leaders, and they actually made a real effort to pull in MAGA folks and to say, okay, we're going to bring you to meet with the county election official, and we want you to pressure test ahead of the election. We want you to stress test everything, ask every question, express all your skepticism, because we want you to be bought in, so that after the election, if people do cast out, you're a credible local messenger who can go out and say, no, like this is legitimate. And Trump won, so no one said the election was stolen. But I think that was a very worthy effort, because that's like, it's about getting the local buy-in, because the truth is a lot of people don't trust the media, and it's a huge problem. I remember having conversations 15 years ago where we panicked that only 60% of people trusted what we said most or all of the time. Now it's like 35%. And that's just not, so it's not enough for the mainstream media, which isn't a monolith, to say it's fine.
We're below lawyers and undertakers now.
Yeah, exactly.
And here in our center, we've created the Certificate in Election Administration, which is the largest program to train election officials. And it's totally factual. It's being taught by the best people in the states at the federal level. So that's another response, which is
great, yeah.
Just rebuild the army of partisans, nonpartisans, who are just patriotic and want to see the process move forward. Let me ask you a question I know you've been thinking about for a while, which is about AI. And already we've seen, just in this election cycle, a couple examples. In Texas, Tellerico's image and voice was used to put him in a dress and have him singing. Peggy Flanagan, who's the U.S. Senate candidate in Minnesota for the Democratic Party, was put on top of a garbage heap. How do you engage either with those obvious AI manipulations or with the increasingly subtle?
The subtle ones scare me more than the obvious ones. We all see, it's just, what I really worry about is people saying, you can't believe anything you see, so don't believe anything, which is like the Russian playbook, right? Just everything is, you can't trust anything you see with your lying eyes. And, at the Washington Post have a visual forensics team where we can validate. We have experts who can validate content and say this is a deep fake or this isn't. And they have, they're technical people and they have ways of doing that. And I think that is valuable. That was super important even during the first weeks of the war in Ukraine, which is now 4 years ago, but taking these videos that were getting posted on social media and saying, well, the shadows line up. We think we have a high degree of confidence that this video is authentic. I think there is value in that. Frankly, I think that we haven't had I came here 2 years ago in June 2024 and talked at a conference you held on AI about how 2024 was going to be the deep fake election. And it actually didn't pan out the way I sort of expected. I thought that there were going to be a lot more. And I thought there were going to be things where it was like audio where it's like, is this really Kamala Harris? Is on the phone saying something disparaging about Wisconsin? I thought that there would be more of that than there has been. But you think like in the Taiwan election, right before the election, the Chinese dropped these videos of the leading candidate who China wanted to stop going into a hotel room with a woman who wasn't his wife. And we don't know if those videos, I think those videos were fabricated, but they dropped those right before and they were widely distributed. But that's sort of scary because that is the brave new world we're in. And that worries me more than taking a tweet and putting it in someone's voice, although that is bad too.
So let's say we have a Taiwan example here
Yeah.
in 2026. What is the Washington Post going to do about it?
Those are really difficult judgment calls because if everyone is talking about it, how do you cover it without drawing more attention to it? If you don't know either way, if it becomes a real issue, if one of the candidates is talking about it, I mean, these are things that we think through constantly. But this is where news judgment becomes really important. And in 2016, this isn't new. Obviously, this predates AI. The National Enquirer ran a tabloid cover during the Republican primaries that said Ted Cruz had all these mistresses, and it was very clearly at the time not true. And we learned subsequently about Trump's ties to the National Enquirer. They did the catch and kill with Stormy Daniels. That was at the center of a lot of what came out in the New York fraud trial where he was convicted. Trump was making it an issue. Trump was out there saying Ted Cruz is a scummy guy. And it was really hard. It's the National Enquirer. We can't validate any of the underlying reporting. That's I think a good pre-AI example of how do you cover that without amplifying it. Trump's on the campaign trail talking about it, but you can't just ignore it because everyone is seeing it on social media. And we're going to have more of these kinds of tough judgment calls. And it is hard because we don't have the monopoly anymore. People aren't just getting information from one or two sources. They're getting information from everyone. So you can't just assume like we're going to be responsible gatekeepers and not cover this thing that is obviously false. And we're not going to amplify false information, but just because we still have very high standards. In fact, our standards are higher than ever. But it is this awkward new world where just because the mainstream media chooses to ignore something doesn't mean that it's not going to still get a lot of attention. And then the media, one of the reasons people don't trust the media, there are many. I think we did drop the ball in 2020 on the Hunter Biden laptop. That was bad. And the Biden campaign was out there saying this has all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. They wouldn't confirm the laptop was real. We didn't have the laptop. There were these things that were trickling out. Some of the kind of the smutty personal stuff that doesn't have news value, but some of the stuff about the Chinese business dealings, Ukrainian business dealings had legitimate news value. And the social media companies throttled coverage of even mention of the Hunter laptop. The mainstream media, by and large, ignored it. That was clearly a mistake that undermined trust in the press. So there's always a risk of fighting the last war and fighting the last campaign. But those things need to be top of mind when you're deciding in the final weeks of a campaign how to cover some very high profile development.
Looking ahead, you've been through a bunch of campaigns now. What should we be thinking about as a surprise that's not currently top of mind?
The manipulating the voting, I think, is a real one. I mean, that is actually, I'm happy we have a decentralized election system. Actually, for all the problems that creates, it's a strength of our system. Iran worries me a lot. I have talked to a lot of people who said, like, what would an October surprise from the Iranians look like? Obviously, the administration wants to keep Iran on the shelf and not be top of mind. I mean, Trump's numbers are really bad. It's when we've kind of beaten around it, but like Trump is more unpopular right now than he was right after January 6th. The CNN polling this week shows that Trump's approval was 33%. I mean, that's like Nixon and Watergate number. I mean, that's like Bush after Katrina and the financial crisis. This is like, the numbers are really bad for Trump. And so, what is, and he wants to, we learned yesterday, he's going to run TV ads touting his accomplishments. Republicans are going to have a midterm convention next month in Dallas. And Trump's going to give a keynote primetime address. And Trump said last week, pretend like I'm on the ballot. It's a funny strategy. I mean, Republicans need Trump supporters to come out. It is a mobilization game, but by all accounts, when you look at any polling, any historical trend line, it should be a huge year for Democrats, like a big wave. But redistricting did end up redounding to Republicans' advantage, especially after the Supreme Court decision. I think Democrats are going to win the House. I think if the election were today, Democrats would win the Senate. But it's probably 50-50 right now. And so what you think about, like, if you wanted to change the political dynamic, what does that look like? And so I think something with Iran, I don't think Trump wants to escalate with Iran. I do think if Trump sent troops into Iran, for example, it would break up the MAGA coalition the same way October 7th has broken up the Democratic coalition. So I think he doesn't want like a foreign policy thing, but what you kind of have to, if you're trying to like really shake up the underlying political dynamics, you do have to think through like what would you do?
Just a little background for those of you who are not deep into politics. There is a very strong, almost unbroken tendency for midterm elections in which the president's approval rating is closely associated with how the other party does in congressional elections. So 2018, Donald Trump and the Republicans lost 41 seats because his approval rating was the mid 40s. Today, it's even lower than that. So the question is, is there going to be a big wave? There's a lot of debate about that. One of the challenges, redistricting. The other is, in the United States House of Representatives, not many seats are competitive. Both parties have been redistricting to load up safe seats. So you got, maybe a bit more than 36 competitive seats out of 435. So no, we're not expecting a big swing.
Republicans have a significant financial advantage. The Democratic brand is actually very bad. I mean, we talk about how bad Trump's brand is and how bad the Republican brand is, but like more people have an unfavorable view of the Democratic Party than a favorable view. So it is, elections are choices. It's not just a referendum on Trump. So, on paper, Democrats should do much better than I think they will, but these elections tend to break hard and late, and the map is much smaller than it has been in the past. But you think back to 2010 here in Minnesota, people didn't think Jim Oberstar was in danger, and then all of a sudden he lost, to a nobody that wasn't on it. That wasn't on the map, the national map at least. So I mean, those kinds of things happen in big years where it's like, okay, wow, like Trump won this district by 15 points. I mean, you look at some of these special elections, Democrats have been doing so well in. So I don't foreclose the possibility that it breaks hard and late. But even like 2022, that should have been a big year for Republicans on paper, and it wasn't, partly because of Dobbs, and that was hugely motivating for the Democratic base.
Mr. Hagi?
A few minutes ago, we were talking about democratic socialists and the rift in the Democratic Party. One view is that the Democrats who take those ultra progressive views are going to scare off centrist voters who are still trying to decide. We're a little conservative, nervous about that. Another view is that progressive candidates, Peggy Flanagan as an example, may be motivating and drawing to the polls younger, disaffected voters who they don't want the usual stuff. They want somebody to shake the foundations, whether they're on the left or the right. A friend of mine said the other morning, maybe we're at an FDR moment where the country is ready for big changes, Social Security, minimum wage, that kind of stuff. Do you see any potential for that in Mamdani and?
Yeah,
Peggy
Mamdani
Flanagan?
definitely brings people out, and I do. I think that you can't discount that. Trump brought people out who'd never voted before. Trump just identified these huge pools of voters in the industrial Midwest who weren't engaged in politics. So I do think that there definitely is an opportunity. It will be interesting. People are going to no matter what the outcome in November, people will, as they always do after every election, the media will be most to blame, but we'll overread the election results. I mean, you think about the two biggest Republican elections in my lifetime were 1994 and 2010, and those were huge Republican waves. And in both cases, a Democrat won the presidency 2 years later, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. I think Michigan is one to watch because it is a test of this. Trump won Michigan twice. If Abdul El-Sayed wins that Senate race against a pretty mainstream Republican, generic Republican, then I do think that says something. On the other hand, how much of it was going to be because it's a big Democratic year, but because it's Michigan and will be a presidential battleground again in 2028, I think people will read a lot into that race. If El-Sayed loses, but Democrats win all these other Senate races, maybe that's a sign that he didn't find a way to bring new people out. But I don't think that that's going to be that will tell us everything, but I do think that will be a good indicator.
Corruption,
Yeah.
misbehavior by presidents and others who are in high office has a long history of shaking up politics, except now.
Yeah.
And I was thinking back to Bill Clinton and an obscure land deal that he was alleged to have been part of that just haunted him for years and ended up, of course, leading to his impeachment and to, kind of a besmirching of his standing. Here we've got a president who is conducting openly the most transactional, corrupt deal making. Why is that not receiving from voters? Because I think the media has been covering it. Why hasn't that received more outrage from voters?
I think people feel like it doesn't affect them. Like it is the pocketbook thing. One of the things I'm baffled by this. I think about it all the time. It's an amazing and important question, and I wish I had a satisfying answer. That people are, I think when you go out and talk to a lot of low information everyday voters, there's this perception that everyone is corrupt, and that all the politicians have been corrupt, and so Trump's just doing it out in the open. So but this is what they're all like this, which isn't true. But I think that is a feeling that's out there. But it is frankly baffling. I mean, it's just there's so many things that we are covering it.
Yeah.
And in a historical time, it would have been really earth-shattering, even in the first term. But a lot of those, the Republicans who stood up to Trump in the first term are almost all gone or are leaving. And so some of it is the lack of pushback from his own party, I think has prevented some of the stories from having legs that they might have otherwise.
So the Democrats get a majority in the House or the Senate or both. They're going to run investigations.
Yeah.
Is the response to that going to be just kind of partisan triggering, that Republicans will rally to Donald Trump, Democrats will rally to Donald Trump as a crook, or will there be kind of a more national kind of outrage?
It's really hard to foresee. I think some of it depends on how badly the midterms go for Republicans in November. And if Donald Trump's never going to be on the ballot again. And so if Republicans, and the lesson, if you're an ambitious rank and file Republican lawmaker, there are hundreds of cases over the last decade where having any courage to stand up to Trump ends your political career. And so there's, even if Trump is really unpopular, I think people are still going to remember those lessons. And I do think people will go to their partisan corners. Remember in the first term, Pelosi and Schumer really resisted impeaching Trump for months and months and months. And they thought it would be a distraction. They knew Trump wouldn't ultimately get convicted and removed. And it will be interesting to see. It seems inevitable that if Democrats win the House, I think they will try to impeach Trump again. But I'm not sure that's actually politically helpful. It'll make, the risk for 2028 for Democrats is that it looks like, they're not focused on you. They're not focused on pocketbook, inflation, affordability. We gave them power again and they just went after Trump, and people are kind of used to, it's just like, this is what politicians do. So I think that there is some risk. On the other hand, how can you just ignore or look away from, the what Rahm Emanuel calls the 3 C's: corruption, chaos, and cruelty, which I think is a good way. He said Rahm's view is Democrats need to just relentlessly focus on the 3 C's and talk about everything fits in one of those 3 buckets. But if you can't ignore it, but you also can't seem like you're consumed by it.
We've reached the end of our hour. I want to thank Mr. Dave Hage for joining us. And I can't thank you enough for coming out and spending time with us. This has been a terrific conversation. And for those of you who've been following this, it is a real insight and a smart insight to where we are as a country and where we're going.
Sorry, I feel like I should have had more levity and been funnier. And it's just, there's a lot of dark side. I haven't made any jokes, but it's a sobering time. But we've been through chapters like this before, and we're gonna, I do feel like our institutions will prove resilient and democracy will work, and the voters will get to have a say in November and again in 2028.
Yeah. Thank you, James. I want to just quickly mention a few programs we've got coming up as part of our 2026 midterm election series. The next program, September 17th, is titled, Will There Be Fair Elections? And it's got a phenomenal lineup. We've got 2 of the best people, nonpartisan experts on election administration. We've got the former Republican Kentucky Secretary of State, Trey Grayson, and political analyst Norm Ornstein joining that. So I'm looking forward to that. It's going to be spectacular. On September 30th, we're going to have a deep dive on redistricting. Obviously, Republicans did well, but there are a lot of questions about how well they did and the consequences in terms of the racial balance in Congress, in terms of the longer term shakeout. October 7th, we're joined by 2 of our favorites. Republican consultant Kirsten Kukowski, who worked for Scott Walker, will be with us, and Democratic strategist Rebecca Piercy, who is the campaign manager for Elizabeth Warren. They're going to be here, and if you've been to that conversation before, you'll look forward to it. If you haven't, it's terrific. These are 2 people, couldn't disagree more, but they're so pleasant and so smart, and the smartness converges. Often they'll just agree. So we've got a bunch of other programs coming up, and so you can scan the QR code if you're joining us online, or sign up here and we will get you information about those programs. If you've enjoyed this program, it is going to be up on all your favorite podcasts as a video recording. So please check that out. And if you've enjoyed this, please consider making a contribution. We always appreciate that. Once again, James, thank you so much for joining us.